The U.S. Army tried to remove him 8 times, not once, not twice. 8 times, every report said the same thing: bad discipline, poor attitude, refuses to follow orders. And yet on one morning in 1944, that same man stood on a broken hill in France with only 35 exhausted soldiers beside him. They had no food, no clean water, no medical supplies. They had been eating weeds to survive, their lips were cracked, their hands shook from thirst. Below them waited more than 700 German troops, fresh, supplied, confident. The only bridge they could retreat across had already been destroyed by American aircraft. At 7:22 in the morning, a German officer walked forward under a white flag. He did not come to surrender, he came to demand it. From his point of view, the battle was finished. From the American point of view, it had barely begun. The man in charge of the Americans was named Jake McNiss. He was 25 years old. His hair was shaved into a sharp strip down the center of his head. White paint streaked his face, his uniform was filthy, his record was worse. Jake looked at the officer, then he looked at his men. He said only 3 words: "If you want it, come take it." 3 days later, more than 100 German soldiers were dead or wounded. Jake lost no one. This is the story of how the Army's biggest problem became one of its greatest weapons. Long before France, long before Normandy, Jake McNiss had already been fighting a war, not against Germany, against the Army itself. Jake was born in Oklahoma during the Great Depression. His family was large, 10 children. Food was never certain, comfort was rare. If something broke, it stayed broken unless you fixed it yourself. Jake learned early that waiting did not help. If you wanted something, you took action. He hunted as a boy, he learned to track. He learned patience. He learned when to move and when to stay still. By 19, he was a firefighter. He ran toward flames while others ran away. Fear never left him, but it never stopped him either. When war came, Jake did not wait for orders. He volunteered, not for medals, not for speeches. He volunteered because paratroopers were sent where things went wrong. That sounded useful to him. Basic training started at Fort Benning. Problems started immediately. On his first week, a senior soldier took Jake's food and laughed. Jake warned him once. The man laughed again. Jake broke his nose. That should have ended everything. It did not. Later that same day, Jake ran the demolition course faster than anyone before him. Instructors were furious and impressed at the same time. That became a pattern. Jake ignored rules that made no sense to him. He skipped formalities. He spoke directly. He did not hide his thoughts. When an officer once demanded respect, Jake replied that his job was to kill enemies, not polish leather. The word spread quickly. Officers hated him for it. But they could not deny the numbers. He shot better. He ran longer. He carried more weight without slowing down. Instead of removing him, the Army isolated him. They gave him his own space, his own group. Whenever another soldier caused trouble, that soldier was sent to Jake. Fighters, rule breakers, men who could not fit into neat lines. Without planning it, Jake became the leader of the unwanted. They did not look like soldiers. They did not act like soldiers, but they performed better than anyone else. One man could break boards with his fists. Another spoke several languages and could pull information from prisoners with ease. One loved explosives too much. Another had never lost a fistfight. Together they became a strange unit. The Army called them a problem. Other soldiers called them dangerous. Jake called them a pack. He did not train them to obey. He trained them to survive. They ran until their legs burned. They fired until their arms shook. They carried weight that made others quit. If someone could not keep up, Jake sent him away. No paperwork, no shouting, just facts. Officers argued constantly about the group. Some wanted punishment, some wanted answers. The truth was uncomfortable. The worst soldiers on paper were the best in the field. Before anyone realized it, the Army had created something it did not understand. And soon, that thing would be dropped into the darkest night Europe had ever seen. Because training was ending, planes were waiting. And the war was about to test whether chaos could survive where order failed. Next, the night the sky caught fire and Jake fell straight into history, training did not end with paperwork for Jake McNiss and his men. It ended when the Army quietly admitted something it did not want to say out loud. The group everyone tried to hide was outperforming every other platoon. Still, hope remained. The officers believed Jake would eventually go too far. They believed he would finally cross a line they could not ignore. They believed the problem would solve itself. They did not have to wait long. One night before deployment, Jake and his men went into a small bar near Fort Benning. They were off duty, they were off base. For once they were calm, no fights, no noise, just tired men sitting with drinks. Then 2 military police walked in. The MPs saw Jake's group and decided to act. One grabbed a paratrooper and accused him of causing trouble. Jake stood up slowly. He asked if there was a problem. The MP told him to sit down and stay quiet. Jake did not argue, he moved. When it was over, both MPs were on the floor. Their jaws were broken. Jake stepped outside, fired every round from both pistols into a street sign, then returned and sat down. He waited. Jake did not run. He did not hide. He waited for the MPs to wake up. They dragged him to his commanding officer. The officer opened Jake's file, page after page of trouble, assaults, disobedience, warnings. The officer sighed. On paper, Jake's career was finished. Instead of punishment, the officer made an offer. There was an old endurance test, a 136-mile march between bases. Almost no one had completed it. If Jake and his men tried it, the incident would be forgotten. Jake agreed instantly. Then he added a condition. He would complete the march in full combat gear. He would not change his socks. He would finish without a single blister. The officer laughed. He said it was impossible. Jake said, "Watch." 10 days later, Jake crossed the finish point. His boots were ruined. His gear was soaked with sweat and mud. His feet were uninjured. Army doctors examined him in disbelief. The charges disappeared. The army had failed again. Soon after, Jake and his platoon were shipped overseas. England welcomed them with rules. Rationing was strict. Meat was limited. Hunting was illegal. Fishing without permits was forbidden. Jake looked at the small food portions. Then he looked at the countryside. He made a decision. His men needed strength. Strength required food. Rules that weakened fighters made no sense to him. Within weeks, his platoon ate better than most officers. They used old skills, traps, careful shots, knowledge learned long before uniforms. Complaints followed. A local landowner demanded action. Jake's commander summoned him. Jake did not deny anything. He said his men needed real food. The officer argued laws. Jake argued survival. Finally, the officer asked what he was supposed to do. Jake answered calmly, "Send us somewhere dangerous." The officer realized the problem. Threats meant nothing to a man who volunteered for danger. Not long after, a photographer arrived. Jake shaved his head into a sharp strip. He painted his face. His men followed. The photographer took pictures. History was made by accident. Jake did not care. He cared about the jump. On the night of June 5, 1944, Jake and his men boarded their aircraft. They were quiet now, focused, calm. The plane lifted into the dark. Over the coast of France, the sky exploded with fire. German guns reached upward. The aircraft shook. An explosion ripped through the plane. Fire, screaming metal. The aircraft broke apart. Jake was thrown into open air. His parachute opened unevenly. He spun. One panel burned. He fell fast and hit water. Gear dragged him under. He cut himself free and surfaced, gasping. Burning debris fell around him. He was alive. Jake moved immediately. He searched for survivors. One by one, he found them, muddy, injured. Shaken, 9 men gathered. Others were gone. Jake did not hesitate. They moved toward their objective. Patrols fell. Ambushes struck fast. More paratroopers joined them. 9 became 35. By late morning, they captured the bridge. Hours later, American aircraft destroyed it. Jake laughed once. Then he looked at the terrain. No bridge meant no retreat. He chose the high ground. He studied the slope. He saw narrow paths, natural funnels. He placed his men carefully. Machine guns overlapped. Riflemen watched the leaders. They were hungry. They were tired. They were ready. German scouts appeared the next morning. Then more probing attacks followed. Everyone failed. On June 9th, a German officer approached under a white flag. He explained the numbers. Jake listened politely. Then he refused. The officer returned downhill. The first wave came soon after. Jake waited. He raised his hand. The hill erupted in fire. Next, the moment 35 men stopped 700 and the Germans realized the ground itself was against them. The German officer did not look angry when he turned away. He looked certain. From his view, the Americans were already finished. 35 tired men on a bare hill could not stop a full force. It was simple math. Jake McNiss watched him go. He felt the dry ache in his throat. He ignored it. He had learned long ago that discomfort was just noise. Below the hill, German soldiers began to move. Jake raised his hand not to signal fear but patience. He wanted the enemy close enough that running would be hard, close enough that mistakes would be final. The first wave came just after 9 in the morning. 200 German infantry moved uphill in tight formation. Their boots crushed grass and dirt. Their rifles were ready. Officers shouted short commands. They believed speed would overwhelm the Americans. Jake watched their movement carefully. He saw exactly what he expected. The slope narrowed near the top. Trees and thick brush forced the soldiers closer together. The path bent slightly left. It was a natural funnel. Jake waited. The Germans entered the choke point. Men pressed shoulder to shoulder. Those in the back pushed forward, unaware of what waited above. Jake dropped his hand. The hill exploded. 2 heavy machine guns opened at once. The sound was deep and steady. Rifle fire followed in sharp, controlled bursts. The Americans did not spray bullets. Every shot had purpose. The first German line collapsed instantly. Men fell into each other. Some tripped over bodies. Others froze, shocked by the sudden violence. Within minutes, the attack broke. Survivors scrambled downhill, dragging wounded and leaving others behind. The slope was quiet again. Jake checked his men. No one was hit. The Germans pulled back. Officers shouted. Medics moved forward. Jake watched them through binoculars. He saw confusion, not fear yet. He knew more would come. The second attack arrived late in the morning. This time, mortars fired first. Shells arced overhead and slammed into the forward slope. Dirt and wood flew into the air. The noise was deafening. Jake had placed his men just behind the crest of the hill. The mortars landed short. The blasts looked powerful, but they did little damage. When the shelling stopped, another wave advanced. Again, the Germans moved into the same narrow paths. Again, they bunched together. Again, Jake waited until they were too close to stop. Fire ripped through the slope. The second wave collapsed faster than the first. Men dropped where they stood. Others rolled downhill, wounded and screaming. Still no American casualties. By midday, German commanders were angry. They changed tactics. Artillery arrived. Heavy shells slammed into the hill. Trees snapped. The ground shook. Smoke covered everything. Jake and his men stayed low, pressed into shallow cover. Dirt fell over them like rain. The shelling lasted nearly half an hour, then it stopped. 2 tanks rolled forward, followed by infantry. The tanks moved up the road toward the slope. Their guns fired again and again. Explosions tore into the hillside. Jake studied them calmly. The tanks could not raise their guns high enough to hit his positions. If they left the road, they would sink into soft ground. Without infantry support, they were blind. Jake gave a quiet order: ignore the tanks. When the infantry followed the armor into the narrow road, American guns opened again. The soldiers had no cover. They fell fast. The tanks rolled forward alone, useless and exposed. After a short time, the tanks withdrew. Jake checked his men again, still 0 losses. The Germans did not attack again that day. Smoke hung low. The wounded cried out below the hill. Jake did not allow his men to move. Helping now would reveal positions. It was a hard order. His men understood. That night was long. The Americans had no food, no water. Some chewed grass to keep their mouths wet. Others sucked on pebbles. No one complained. They had learned to trust Jake. Jake whispered to them in the dark. He told them to listen. The Germans were tired too. At dawn, the 4th attack came. This time, the Germans pushed from 3 directions at once. Mortars fired again. Infantry moved carefully. They tried to avoid tight groups. It did not matter. The terrain forced them together. The same choke points swallowed them. Machine guns cut them down. Riflemen picked off leaders. By noon, more German bodies covered the slope. Another white flag appeared. Jake refused to meet it. He sent word instead: "We are still here." The final attack came in the afternoon. This one was desperate. Hundreds of German soldiers charged uphill at once. They shouted. They fired wildly. Some dropped rifles and ran forward screaming. Jake waited longer than before. When he gave the signal, the guns tore through the charge. Bodies piled so thick that others tripped over them. The slope became impassable. The attack collapsed. By evening, the Germans stopped trying. Jake's men were shaking now, not from fear. From hunger, from exhaustion, from the strain of holding focus for days, they held their positions through the night. On the morning of June 10th, American reinforcements arrived. They expected to find a massacre. Instead, they found 35 men still standing. Jake reported casualties. "None," he said. The officer stared at him. "None. The impossible had happened. But the war was not finished with Jake McNiss, not even close." Next. The frozen city, the blind jump, and the mission no one else would accept. The hill finally fell silent on the morning of June 10th. Smoke drifted across the slope. Broken weapons lay scattered among bodies. The ground was torn and dark. But at the top of the hill, 35 Americans still stood. They looked nothing like heroes. Their faces were hollow. Their uniforms were stiff with dirt and blood that was not theirs. Their mouths were dry. Their hands shook as the rush faded. Some leaned on rifles just to stay upright. Jake McNiss stood among them, just as tired, just as dirty. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply nodded once when the relief force arrived. An officer from the incoming unit asked for a report. Jake gave it: 35 men, 0 casualties. The officer blinked, certain he had misheard. Jake repeated himself. Only then did the weight of what had happened begin to settle. 35 exhausted paratroopers had stopped more than 700 enemy soldiers for 3 days. Not with luck, not with miracles, with ground, timing, and discipline of a different kind. The unit was pulled back soon after. Food finally arrived. Water tasted like heaven. Men ate slowly, almost carefully, as if afraid the moment would vanish if they rushed it. Jake sat apart, chewing without expression. His job was not done. It never felt done to him. Command reports moved up the chain quickly. Names were written down. Numbers were checked twice. Officers argued again, just like before. Some praised Jake's instincts. Others worried about his methods. No one questioned the result. But war did not pause for discussion. Within weeks, Jake and what remained of his original group were scattered into other units. Some were killed, some were wounded, some disappeared into the chaos of the campaign. Only a handful of the original group remained with him. Jake survived Normandy, he survived France, he survived constant fighting. By winter, the war changed again, snow replaced mud, cold replaced heat, the enemy did not retreat. Instead, they struck back with force. In December of 1944, German armies launched a massive attack through the Ardennes, forests swallowed sound, roads vanished under snow, American lines were broken and bent. A small town named Bastogne became the center of everything. American units were surrounded, roads were cut, supplies stopped, the cold was brutal, men lacked coats, ammunition ran low, wounded soldiers froze where they lay. The town was trapped. If it fell, the enemy would split the Allied advance. The army needed a solution. They found Jake McNiss. The problem was simple and impossible at the same time. Supplies had to be dropped from the air. But thick fog covered Bastogne. Enemy guns filled the sky. Pilots could not see the ground. Dropping blind meant losing planes and crews. Only one option remained: pathfinders, small teams who jumped ahead of supply planes. They set radio signals so pilots could find the drop zones. It was dangerous even under perfect conditions. Bastogne had none. The call went out, volunteers only. Jake did not hesitate, he stepped forward immediately. Before dawn on December 18th, Jake boarded a transport plane with 9 other men. The pilot warned them the mission should not happen. Visibility was near zero. Enemy fire was heavy. Jake listened, then he shrugged. They took off. As the plane reached the town, the world outside vanished into white. Fog swallowed everything. There was no ground, no horizon, only sound and vibration. The jump master hesitated. Jake did not. He stepped into nothing. The fall was short and violent. He hit the ground hard and rolled. Snow filled his mouth. His body screamed with pain. He stood anyway. American soldiers nearby stared in disbelief. "Who jumps into Bastogne right now?" one asked. Jake brushed snow from his jacket. "Where are the Germans?" he asked. The answer was simple: everywhere. Jake did not wait. He began searching for his team. The fog hid everything. Buildings were broken. Streets were empty and loud at the same time. Shells landed without warning. Bullets cracked through white air. One by one, Jake found his men. Some were injured, some were shaken, some were close to freezing. 2 were gone, 8 would have to be enough. Jake split them into 2 groups. He placed them on opposite sides of the town. They climbed rooftops. They hid radios inside ruins. They set signals and moved them often to avoid detection. Every signal sent was a risk. Enemy guns listened. Enemy artillery waited. At 10:17 in the morning, Jake made the call. Bastogne was alive. The answer came back. Supply planes were coming. The first aircraft broke through the clouds low and fast. Enemy fire erupted. The plane shook but held steady. Crates fell from the sky. Food, ammo, medicine. The plane escaped. Jake allowed himself one deep breath, then he called again and again. Through the day and night, supply planes came. Fog never lifted. Fire never stopped. Jake and his men moved signals, dodged shells, and stayed awake until their eyes burned. By the 20th, more than 200 supply drops had landed. Bastogne held. When ground forces finally broke through days later, the town still stood. Thousands of men were alive because supplies had reached them when nothing else could. Jake did not receive a medal. The mission was classified. He did not ask for recognition. He had never wanted it, but the war was not finished with him yet. Next, the final battles, the long fall back to peace, and the quiet life no one expected him to choose. When the fighting around Bastogne finally eased, Jake McNiss did not feel relief. He felt empty. His body had been running on instinct for weeks. Once the danger faded, the exhaustion hit him all at once. He slept where he could. Sometimes on floors, sometimes in broken buildings. The cold never fully left his bones. Even when fires burned nearby, his hands stayed stiff. Bastogne survived, but the cost was written on every face. Men looked older than they were. Their eyes carried weight. Jake saw it and said nothing. He had learned that words rarely helped after something like that. The army moved on quickly. New orders replaced old ones. Jake was not praised. He was not punished. He was simply used again. That was how it always worked. Germany began to collapse in early 1945. Cities fell. Units surrendered. Roads filled with refugees and broken equipment. Jake moved with the 101st Airborne into occupied territory. For the first time in years, he was not under fire. That was when trouble returned. Without combat, Jake had nothing to push against. The sharp focus that kept him alive had nowhere to go. Days stretched long and quiet. Nights felt worse. The men were assigned occupation duties, guarding property, watching roads, standing still. Jake hated it. They were placed near large estates once owned by high-ranking German leaders. The buildings were untouched by bombing. Inside were things Jake had never seen in one place. Expensive bottles, fine furniture, art on every wall. The war felt unreal here. One estate belonged to a powerful German figure. His name meant nothing to Jake. What mattered was that the place stood while others burned. Jake and the few remaining men from his old group did something simple. They lived, they rode horses left behind, they drank what was left in cabinets, they laughed louder than they had in years. It was not cruelty, it was release. For a brief moment they felt human again. It did not last. Reports reached command. Complaints followed. Jake was summoned once more. The pattern felt familiar. But this time something was different. The army did not threaten him. They did not argue. They did not try to fix him. They let him go. Jake was sent back to the United States for medical review. Years of stress had worn his body down. His hearing was damaged. His joints ached. His sleep was broken. While waiting, he got into another fight with military police. This time there were no second chances, no endurance tests, no offers. The army discharged him honorably. After years of chaos, it ended quietly. Jake went home to Oklahoma. The war followed him. There were no parades waiting. No speeches, no one asked questions. People expected him to return to normal life as if nothing had happened. Jake tried. He drank to quiet his thoughts. He drank to avoid sleep. When he did sleep, memories returned without warning. Noise made him flinch. Silence felt heavy. The skills that kept him alive in war did not help in peace. He drifted, he argued, he pushed people away. He did not know how to explain what he felt and no one knew how to ask. Years passed this way. In 1951, Jake drove his car into a telephone pole. The crash was violent. Metal folded, glass shattered. Doctors said he should not have survived. He woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed. His body was broken. His ribs hurt when he breathed. His head throbbed. For the first time in years, he could not move. Lying there, Jake had time. He thought about planes burning in the sky, about men frozen in snow, about hills covered in bodies. He also thought about how he was dying now slowly, without purpose. That night, Jake made a simple decision. He would stop drinking. Not tomorrow, not slowly, now, and he did. Recovery was not easy. Pain stayed, memories stayed, but his mind slowly cleared. 6 months later, he married a woman from Oklahoma named Mary Catherine. She knew he had served. She did not know the details. Jake kept it that way. He wanted something different. They built a quiet life. Jake took a job sorting mail at the local post office. He wore a clean shirt. He stood in lines. He followed schedules. He raised children. They never saw war paint. They never heard stories of killing. They never knew their father had once held a hill against hundreds of soldiers. Jake made sure of that. Years turned into decades. Jake became a familiar face in town. He waved at neighbors. He went to church. He coached youth sports. He lived carefully. The army never contacted him again. Jake did not miss it. He believed war should not be remembered with pride. He believed survival was not something to celebrate loudly. He lived until the age of 93. When he died, there were no headlines. A small notice marked his passing. To most people, he was just a quiet man who sold stamps and raised a family. And that was exactly what he wanted. But history tells a different story. 8 times the army tried to remove him. 8 times they failed. Each time they failed, lives were saved later. Because when the war needed someone to hold a hill, to jump into fog, to guide planes through fire, to stand against impossible numbers, Jake McNiss was there. Not because he followed rules well, but because he understood what mattered when rules stopped working. Next, why the army never fully understood him, and why that misunderstanding changed history. Understanding changed history. The army never knew what to do with Jake McNiss. That truth followed him even after the war ended. On paper, he was a problem. In reality, he was an answer the system did not know how to ask for. During the war, officers argued about him constantly. Some called him reckless. Others called him uncontrollable. A few understood something deeper but did not know how to say it without sounding disloyal to the rules they had grown up with. Jake did not fit clean boxes. He never cared about rank. He never chased praise. He never tried to prove he was right. He simply acted. That was what made him dangerous to bureaucracy. The army was built on order. Jake was built on purpose. When those two aligned, the results were incredible. When they did not, sparks flew. After Bostonia, internal reports circulated quietly. They described a Pathfinder team that kept a surrounded city alive. They described radio signals moved under fire. They described pilots flying blind into gunfire because a voice on the ground told them where to go. Jake's name appeared in those reports. Then it disappeared. Pathfinder missions were classified. Details were sealed. Credit was spread thin and vague. No one wanted to explain how close Bostonia came to falling. And no one wanted to explain that a man the army tried to discharge repeatedly had made the difference. Jake never knew most of this. He never read the reports. He never saw the arguments. He had already left that world behind. In Oklahoma, he built routines instead of defenses. He woke early. He drank coffee slowly. He walked to work. Sorting mail did not require instinct or violence. It required patience. That suited him more than people expected. At first, the quiet felt wrong. His hands wanted to move faster than needed. His eyes scanned rooms automatically. Sudden sounds made his muscles tighten before his mind caught up. Mary Catherine noticed. She did not ask questions, she did not push. She understood that some things healed better in silence. Jake coached children later. Baseball, simple rules, clear goals, he liked that. When a child froze under pressure, Jake knelt and spoke calmly. He told them to breathe, to focus on the next small thing. Parents thought he was good with kids, they had no idea why. Years passed, Jake grew older. His body slowed, but his awareness never left. He noticed when people were tired before they admitted it. He noticed tension in rooms before voices rose. War had trained him for that. Once a man at the post office complained loudly about government rules. Jake listened quietly. When the man finished, Jake said only one thing. "Rules don't save you, people do." The man laughed, thinking it was a joke. It was not. Far away, the army continued to study battles like Normandy and Bostonia. New officers wrote papers, new doctrines formed, technology advanced. Radios improved, aircraft improved, weapons improved, but the core lesson remained uncomfortable. Sometimes the system worked because someone ignored it at the right moment. Jake was rarely mentioned by name, instead phrases appeared. Unconventional leadership, adaptive response, decentralized decision-making. Clean words for messy truth. That truth was this. If Jake McNiss had followed orders perfectly, many men would have died. If he had obeyed without question, the hill in Normandy would have fallen. If he had waited for approval, Bostonia would have starved. If he had cared about punishment, supply planes would never have found their mark. The army understood this in pieces, never fully, because fully understanding it would mean admitting something dangerous. That sometimes the best soldier is the one who knows when not to listen. Jake never framed it that way. He hated philosophy. He hated speeches. If asked, he would have shrugged and said he did what worked. That was not satisfying to institutions built on structure. As the Cold War began, the army changed again. New threats, new fears, new manuals. Jake faded further into the background. He liked it that way. At home, his children grew. They asked about his service once or twice. Jake gave short answers. He said he jumped out of planes. He said it was cold. He said he was lucky. That was all. He did not want them to imagine him as a fighter. He wanted them to imagine a future where fighting was not required. In the early 2000s, historians began digging deeper into old records. Files were declassified, names resurfaced. Bostonia was studied again. Jake's name appeared. Some researchers were confused. They expected medals, promotions, speeches. They found none. One historian wrote that Jake McNiss was an example of operational brilliance hidden behind administrative discomfort. Jake never read that line. He was busy living. When he passed away in 2013, his death did not ripple through headlines. It rippled quietly through archives and among a small group of people who finally understood his impact. They began connecting dots. The hill, the bridge, the city. Patterns emerged. Jake McNiss had not won battles through force alone. He had won them through positioning, timing, and understanding fear. He understood how men moved under pressure. He understood how terrain shaped choices. He understood when waiting was stronger than acting. Those were not things the army could easily teach. They were learned, often the hard way. Jake's life closed without fanfare. His children mourned a father. His neighbors mourned a friend. The world moved on, but his influence did not disappear. It waited. Because somewhere at some future moment, another unit would face impossible odds. Another officer would look at a map and feel that rules were not enough. And without knowing why, they would choose the ground, they would choose patience, they would choose defiance that served a purpose, they would choose survival, and in that choice Jake McNiss would live again. Next. The final reckoning, why history almost forgot him and why forgetting him would be the greatest mistake of all. History is not fair to people like Jake McNiss. It prefers clean stories, clear heroes. Obedient men who rise through ranks and fit neatly into records. Jake did none of that. Because of this, his story almost disappeared. After the war, the army moved forward fast. New enemies appeared. New strategies replaced old ones. Attention shifted. The men who survived tried to forget. The men who studied tried to simplify. Jake did not fit simple lessons. Military schools spoke of Normandy, but rarely of the small hill held by starving paratroopers. They spoke of Bostonia, but focused on generals, speeches, and supply lines, not the man who jumped blind into fog to make those lines possible. Jake's actions were inconvenient. They raised questions no system liked to answer. Why did 35 men survive against 700? Why did German attacks fail again and again? Why did supplies reach a surrounded city when logic said they should not? The answers pointed to a man who ignored rules at the right time. That made people uncomfortable. For years, Jake existed only as a footnote. A name in after-action reports, a reference in classified documents, someone important but not celebrated. Some officers remembered him clearly. They spoke of him quietly. They said things like, "You should have seen McNiss." Or, "That man saw the battlefield differently." But quiet memories fade. Jake himself never tried to preserve his story, he never wrote memoirs, he never spoke at events. He never corrected anyone who misunderstood him. He believed war stories became lies once people tried to make them impressive. He lived simply. That was his answer to chaos. As his children grew older, they noticed small things. Their father hated crowds, he disliked fireworks. He always sat where he could see doors. He woke early even on weekends. They thought it was habit, they never pushed. Mary Catherine understood more than anyone else. She saw how Jake sometimes stared into nothing. How certain smells stopped him cold. How he could become distant without warning. She never demanded explanations. That quiet understanding mattered more than words. When Jake retired from the post office, co-workers held a small gathering. They praised his reliability, his kindness, his calm. No one mentioned war. Jake smiled politely and went home. Years later, when historians began to reopen World War II archives, Bostonia came back into focus. New research uncovered details long buried. Pathfinder operations were no longer fully hidden. Jake's name surfaced again. Some researchers were stunned. They expected a decorated officer. They found a private with disciplinary records instead. That contradiction sparked curiosity. Slowly, the pieces came together. The hill in Normandy, the destroyed bridge, the German surrender demand, the frozen city, the blind jump. Patterns formed. This was not luck. This was not chaos. This was understanding. Jake understood terrain. He understood fear. He understood that people moved toward what felt safe and froze when safety disappeared. He also understood himself. He knew he was not suited for peace until peace was forced on him. He accepted that without shame. In interviews conducted late in his life, when pressed gently about his service, Jake gave short answers. He said war was loud. He said it was cold. He said many good men did not come home. He refused to speak about numbers or victories. When asked if he felt proud, he paused for a long time. Then he said, "I'm glad it's over." That was all. Jake died quietly the way he lived. There were no military honors beyond the basics. No large crowd, no speeches about bravery. His children mourned a father, not a legend. Only later did they learn more. They read documents, they heard from historians. They slowly realized the scale of what he had done. It was overwhelming. They understood then why he never talked about it, why he wanted a different life for them. Jake did not want his children to believe violence solved problems. He knew it only delayed them. The army never officially apologized for trying to remove him. It never officially thanked him either. Institutions rarely admit they were wrong in both directions, but quietly his influence spread. New doctrines began to emphasize flexibility, small unit decision-making, initiative under pressure. Officers were encouraged to think, not just follow. Jake's shadow was there even if his name was not. The greatest irony was this. The man the army tried to expel 8 times ended up shaping how it fought, not through rules. Not through rank, but through example. History often forgets people like that because they refuse to explain themselves. Jake McNiss did not want to be remembered as a hero. He wanted to be remembered as a man who came home and lived quietly. But history does not always respect wishes. Sometimes it digs anyway, because forgetting people like Jake is dangerous. It teaches the wrong lesson. It teaches that obedience alone wins wars. It teaches that systems always know best. It teaches that deviation is failure. Jake proved the opposite. He proved that understanding mattered more than compliance. That judgment mattered more than paperwork. That sometimes survival depended on someone brave enough to say no. And that truth still matters. Because somewhere someday another soldier will stand on a hill with too few men, too little time, and impossible odds. When that moment comes, the rules may not help, but the example of Jake McNiss might. Next, the final chapter, why one man's quiet life mattered more than all the battles he survived. In the end, Jake McNiss did not leave behind medals or speeches. He left behind silence. A quiet space where his life once stood, unnoticed by most and misunderstood by many. That silence was not empty, it was full of meaning. Jake lived through moments that should have ended him. Burning aircraft, frozen nights, hills covered in bodies, cities surrounded by enemies. Each time he survived not because he was fearless, but because he understood when fear mattered and when it did not. He never believed war was noble. He believed it was necessary only when it could not be avoided. That belief shaped every choice he made. Jake never chased glory. Glory required witnesses. He preferred results. When the army tried to remove him 8 times, it was not because he failed. It was because he did not behave the way they expected success to look. He challenged assumptions without speeches. He questioned orders by acting instead of arguing. That made him dangerous. Not to enemies, to comfort. Systems depend on predictability. Jake was predictable only in one way. He always did what he believed would keep his men alive. That belief carried him through Normandy. It carried him through Bostonia. It carried him home. After the war, Jake understood something many soldiers never reached. Surviving was not the same as living. He had to choose life again deliberately without adrenaline or purpose handed to him by orders. It was harder than combat. He chose routine. He chose family. He chose silence. Those choices were not weakness. They were courage of a different kind. Jake never spoke publicly about holding off 700 soldiers. He never described the blind jump into fog. He never explained how it felt to guide planes through gunfire while knowing one mistake could starve thousands. He carried those things quietly. People around him saw only fragments. A calm man, a reliable worker. A father who listened more than he spoke, a neighbor who waved and moved on. They did not see the hunter's patience in his eyes. They did not hear the battlefield still echoing in his mind. And that was how he wanted it. When Jake passed away, the world did not stop. Trains still ran, mail still moved. Children still played in the streets of his town. But somewhere far away in dusty archives and faded reports, his name rested beside moments that changed outcomes. The hill that did not fall, the city that did not starve, the planes that found their way through fog. Those moments mattered, not because they were dramatic, but because they were decisive. Jake McNiss never believed one man could change history. He believed one man could change a moment. And sometimes that was enough. The truth is simple. If Jake had followed every rule, men would have died. If he had waited for permission, Bostonia would have fallen. If he had valued order over outcome, history would look very different. The army eventually learned pieces of that lesson. Slowly, carefully, without ever saying his name too loudly. They began teaching flexibility. They began trusting small units more. They began valuing judgment over blind obedience. Jake's influence lived there unseen. His story reminds us of something uncomfortable. Progress often comes from people who do not fit. Survival often depends on those willing to break patterns. And history is shaped not only by leaders, but by those who act when leaders cannot see clearly. Jake McNiss did not ask to be remembered, but remembering him matters. Because his life proves that courage does not always look clean, that discipline does not always wear polish. That leadership sometimes comes from refusal. He was not a perfect soldier. He was something rarer. He was effective. And when the world needed him most, when logic said surrender, when numbers said failure, when rules offered no answer, Jake McNiss stood, looked at the situation, and chose action. He did not shout. He did not boast. He did not explain himself. He simply held the line. That is why the army tried to kick him out 8 times. And that is why in the end he stopped 700 men with 35, saved a city, and walked home to live a quiet life. History almost forgot him. Now it does not have to. Now it does not have to.